It is estimated that in the middle of the 17th century, the number of authors in France amounted to about 2,200 individuals, of which half were men of the church, and 1/4 were nobles, writing for a reading public of probably only a few tens of thousands of individuals. La Religieuse, by Denis Diderot. An essay by Darcy John Bouchard, copyright, L'exil de la famille Miacutetis de la Natio Canada, a nameless nobody, of our sacred blue ever virgin and of church triumphant, an unworthy bastard. Copyright Amai, Unxi. Anathema to much of the French intellectual and ecclesiastical establishment, even now, one of the most complex and controversial figures of the Enlightenment, Denis Diderot, the second child of a widely respected and wealthy master cutler, was born at Langres, Haute-Marne, Champagne, France, continental Europe, on October 5, 1713. Note in 1711/12, Didier Diderot, September 14, 1685, 1759, married Angelique Vigneron, October 12, 1677, 1749. On November 5, 1712, a boy was born of this union, but this child died in infancy. Diderot's sister, Denise, who remained an austere spinster, was born on January 27, 1715, 2 other sisters were also born to his family, one died in infancy and the other died as a child. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was a Genevan philosopher, writer, and composer. His political philosophy influenced the progress of the Enlightenment throughout Europe, as well as aspects of the French Revolution and the development of modern political, economic, and educational thought. Molière, Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, was a French playwright, actor, and poet, widely regarded as one of the greatest writers in the French language and world literature. Voltaire, François-Marie Arouet, was a French Enlightenment writer, historian, and philosopher famous for his wit, his criticism of Christianity, especially the Roman Catholic Church, as well as his advocacy of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and separation of church and state. Continued Diderot's early life, unlike those of his contemporaries, such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau or Voltaire, François-Marie Arouet, is shrouded in mystery. It is commonly understood that whence yet a young man, he hesitated between the Sorbonne priesthood and the stage. Many of the works which he published during his lifetime were anonymous, or were ascribed to other writers, and some of the works for which he is now most noted appeared many years after his death. He attached more importance to his plays than to his novels, and as most of his novels were published only after his death, his plays had the greater influence on his fame and his life, and these constituted almost a revolution in the history of the French theatre. The tradition of the French theatre was that serious, as distinguished from comic, drama should concern itself only with personages of the nobility, and should be written in verse. Diderot now expounded his view that serious drama should not be afraid to use bourgeois characters and occupations, and scenes from domestic life, presented with realism and in prose. He proposed to show that the phrase bourgeois gentilhomme, middle-class gentleman, was not the laughable contradiction in terms that Molière, Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, had taken it to be, but a development of the new society in which the bourgeoisie was rising in wealth, status, and power. The dramatist, he argued, should present not so much studies in character as conditions of actual life, e.g., in the family, in the army, in politics, in the professions, even in industry. And as the middle classes were a chief repository of virtue in France, Diderot insisted that one function of the new drame, as he called it, should be to inspire men with love of virtue and abhorrence of vice. He branded a merely entertaining art as an idle class luxury. Every art should have a social function and use, and what better aim could the theatre have than to make virtue charming? For some 30 years I have against my taste made l'encyclopédie, QV, and written only 2 plays. During his lifetime, his most often reprinted works were 2 plays, though they were hardly ever performed, Les Paris Malheureux, The Illegitimate Son, and Le Père de Famille, The Father of the Family. These complex and very entertaining plays delve into the attitudes of the middle-class bourgeois society to reveal an 18th-century suburbia which populates dramatic and suspenseful situations and settings. Both his younger sister Angelique, 1720–1749, who was Denis' goddaughter, she, of her own accord, became an Ursuline nun, and later died in the cloister, mentally confused, at the age of 28. And brother entered the church. Note there is little to suggest the lifelong discord between Denis and his brother, Didier Pierre, 1722–1787, canon and priest in Langres, who was repeatedly shocked by his older brother's bold disrespect for organized religion. Theirs was an extremely conflict-rich relation because of their diverging worldviews. Continued. And Denis himself visited the Jesuit college in Langres, 1723–1728, whereby he was characterized as a lively and talented pupil, receiving the tonsure from the Bishop of Langres, on August 22, 1726. Note. When, on his father's order, Denis was incarcerated in a monastery, and developed a tendency to suffer from claustrophobia, primitive fears of being trapped by some force or power in a situation from which there is no escape. These dreadful feelings would again be acute during Diderot's incarceration at dungeon of Vincennes, and would continue to haunt the man for the rest of his life, although it would have its most intense literary expression in La Religieuse, conceived in early 1760. Continued. Though he did not in fact enter the church, he went to Paris in 1729 to study theology, and was first educated by the Jesuits, 1728/9, 1732, at the Collège de Harcourt, or at the Lycée Louis Le Grand, or possibly at both of these institutions. On September 2, 1732, he was awarded the Master of Arts degree from the University of Paris, but he chose to abandon his religious studies to devote himself to intellectual pursuits, including higher mathematics, chemistry, philosophy, and modern languages. His father expected him to study medicine or law, but he chose to pursue his own studies and writing, and spent his time with women, and books. My love belongs to books, with them I am perfectly lucky and content, more I need not. Besides, he possessed a preference for music, as also for the theatre. When his financial support was ended, he then studied law as an articled clerk, working in the office of the attorney Clement de Ris, 1732–1734. Of his life, from 1734 to 1744, comparatively little is known. He dropped an early ambition to enter the theatre and, instead, taught for a living, leading a penurious existence writing sermons for missionaries. At one time he seems to have entertained the idea of taking up an ecclesiastical career, but it is most unlikely that he entered a seminary. Yet his work testifies to his having gone through a religious crisis, and he progressed relatively slowly from Roman Catholicism to deism and then to atheism and philosophical materialism. Note. Deism is the philosophical position that rejects revelation as a source of religious knowledge and asserts that reason and observation of the natural world are sufficient to establish the existence of a supreme being or divine creator, but rejects belief in a supernatural deity who intervenes in the universe and interacts with humankind. Atheism is in the broadest sense an absence of belief in the existence of deities. Less broadly, atheism is a rejection of the belief that any deities exist. In an even narrower sense, atheism is specifically the position that there are no deities. Continued. Moreover, that Diderot led a disordered and bohemian existence at this time is made clear in his posthumously published novel La Neveu Rameau, Rameau's nephew. After 10 bohemian years of hand-to-mouth existence as a tutor, translator, and hack journalist, he gradually lost whatever Christian faith he previously had, and began moving towards a materialist position. Matter is the only entity in the universe, and is governed by laws which we understand only imperfectly. Diderot first gained notice in the 1740s translating English works on medicine and philosophy into French, using an English-Latin dictionary and translating the Latin into French. He frequented the coffee houses, particularly the Regence and the Procope, where he met the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau in 1741, and established a friendship with him that was to last 15 years, until it was broken by a quarrel. In 1741 he also met Antoinette Champion, 1710–1796, daughter of a linen draper, and they entered an agreement for marriage, but his father intervened and locked him up in a monastery in close proximity to Troves. After some weeks, he escaped and succeeded in returning to Paris, and in November 1743 they were married secretly, because of his father's disapproval. The relationship was based on romantic love, but the marriage was not a happy one owing to incompatible interests, Antoinette emerging every now and then as a second Uzit or Xanthippe. Note: Princess Uzit, Greek, Sididos or Sidus, was Job's. Her name may have the same root as the word Satan in Hebrew, Sota, unfaithful wife. In the well-known biblical story dealing with the problem of undeserved suffering, Job loses his children, his possessions, and his health. Uzit, do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die. Xanthippe was an ancient Athenian woman, the much younger second wife of Socrates, perhaps as much as 40 years younger, who is especially remembered as being shrewish and scolding, and for having an undesirable temperament and argumentative nature. Continued. Their love bond held, however, despite a temporary liaison with the feminist authoress Madeleine d'Arcent de Puisieux, partly through a common affection for their daughter, Angelique, born ca. 1747, sole survivor of 3 children. She was eventually married to Albert de Vangeul, 1753–1824, a man of some standing at Langres. Diderot lavished care over her education, and she wrote an account of his life and classified his manuscripts. Diderot, as well as other reform critics, such as Rousseau, increasingly attacked the realm of genre painting, which was seen as a distraction, appealing to the eyes, rather than enriching the mind and moving the passions. These critics sought to blame the aristocracy, and women patrons in particular, for encouraging artists to waste their talents. Women were not always portrayed as passive objects, they also provided moral examples, although in ways consistent with the patriarchal ideology of the Enlightenment. Some of the women are rendered as self-absorbed and complacently alluring, others embodied warnings against vices such as promiscuity. The paintings of François Boucher and Jean-Baptiste Chardin, respectively, exemplify the 18th-century tendency to conceive women as vain coquettes or simple, pious beings. Note: François Boucher was a French painter, draftsman, and etcher, who worked in the Rococo style. Boucher is known for his idyllic and voluptuous paintings on classical themes, decorative allegories, and pastoral scenes. He was perhaps the most celebrated painter and decorative artist of the 18th century. Jean-Baptiste Simeon Chardin was an 18th-century French painter. He is considered a master of still life, and is also noted for his genre paintings which depict kitchen maids, children, and domestic activities. Carefully balanced composition and soft diffusion of light and granular impasto characterize his work. Continued. Within Chardin's interiors, women are celebrated at home, whether as tired or distracted kitchen maid, or an attentive mother in her role as a moral guide to her children. Increasing emphasis was placed on the role of women in the family, differential to the patriarch, as advocated by Rousseau and other Enlightenment philosophers. These paintings articulate a vision in which the stable, productive, happy family is one whose members act according to what is assumed to be the natural inclination of their sex. Despite the complaints of reform critics, genre painting was popular even into the decade of the French Revolution. One art critic wrote in 1741, "There is not a woman of the third estate who, passing by, does not think that she is seeing an image of herself." Mature career. In order to earn a living, Diderot undertook work translating the Grecian history by Temple Stanion, 1739, and the Inquiry Concerning Virtue, or Merit by moral philosopher Anthony Ashley Cooper, 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury, 1745, whose fame and influence he spread in France. In 1745, the publisher André Le Breton approached Diderot with a view that bringing out a French translation of Ephraim Chambers' Cyclopedia, after two other translators withdrew from the project. Diderot became general editor of the Encyclopédie au Dictionnaire raisonné des sciences, des arts et des métiers, par une société de gens de lettres, and undertook the task with the distinguished mathematician Jean-Léon d'Alembert as co-editor, but soon profoundly changed the nature of the publication, broadening its scope and turning it into an important organ of radical and revolutionary opinion. He gathered around him a team of dedicated littérateurs, scientists, and even priests, many of whom, as yet unknown, were to make their mark in later life. All were fired with a common purpose, to further knowledge and, by so doing, strike a resounding blow against reactionary forces in church and state. The underlying philosophy was rationalism and a qualified faith in the progress of the human mind. Its emphasis on the importance of the mechanical arts, and its veiled criticisms of the inequities of contemporary France, the L'Encyclopédie was to become the most important work of the Enlightenment, 17 volumes of text and 11 volumes of plates, containing 72,000 articles written by more than 140 contributors. The project absorbed most of his energies from 1750 to 1752. The impact of the L'Encyclopédie was enormous. Through its attempt to classify learning and open all domains of human activity to the readers, L'Encyclopédie gave expression to many of the most important intellectual and social developments of its time, a machine de guerre which served to propagate the Enlightenment. In Pensées philosophiques, Philosophical Thoughts, 1746, Diderot asserts that the universe may have been created by God, but may also be the product of a chance amalgam of atoms, thrown together in random order, which may be only temporary. The Natural Religion, an original work, directed against Blaise Pascal, with new and explosive anti-Christian ideas couched in vivid prose, containing many passages directly translated from or inspired by Shaftesbury. The proceeds of this publication, as of his allegedly indecent anti-novel Les Bijoux Indiscrets, The Indiscreet Jewels, 1748, were used to meet the demands of his mistress, Madeleine de Puisieux, with whom he broke a few years later. The Indiscreet Jewels is the first novel by Denis Diderot, published anonymously in 1748. It is an allegory that portrays King Louis XV as the Sultan Mangogol of the Congo, who owns a magic ring, given him by a genie. The ring has the peculiar ability to make women's vaginas speak and give accounts of their past sexual experiences, much to the surprise and embarrassment of the women who own them. The ring also has the ability to make him invisible, allowing him to listen to the secrets of various women without being seen. The character of Merzouza is a parable of Madame de Pompadour. Note: Temple Stanyan, 1675–1752, was an English civil servant, politician, and author. He is known for his two-volume Grecian history from the end of the Peloponnesian War to the death of Philip of Macedon, first published in 1707. This work has been selected by scholars as being culturally important, and is part of the knowledge base of civilization as we know it. Anthony Ashley Cooper, 3rd Earl of Shaftesbury, was one of the most important English political philosophers and writers of his day. He posited that religion and virtue appear in many respects so nearly related that they are generally presumed inseparable companions. His inquiry concerning virtue, or merit, has been selected by scholars as being culturally important, and is part of the knowledge base of civilization as we know it. André-François Le Breton, 1708–1779, was a French publisher. He was one of the four publishers of L'Encyclopédie of Diderot and d'Alembert, along with Michel-Antoine David, Laurent Durand, and Antoine-Claude Briasson. Le Breton contributed some articles to the Encyclopédie, see external links, below, but acted primarily as publisher and editor, often against Diderot's will. In 1745, Le Breton set out to publish a translation of Cyclopedia, or A Universal Dictionary of Arts and Sciences is an encyclopedia prepared by Ephraim Chambers and first published in 1728. He initially chose Jean-Paul de Guademalves as his editor, but he tired of the job after 2 years, and in 1747, the editorship went to Diderot. Jean-Baptiste Léron d'Alembert, 1717–1783, was a French mathematician, mechanician, physicist, philosopher, and music theorist. He was born illegitimately to the salon hostess Madame de Tencin and the military officer Chevalier d'Estouches, d'Alembert. Until 1759 he was, together with Denis Diderot, a co-editor of the Encyclopédie. Mangagul found Zaid in her cabinet. Suleiman was there with her. He held his mistress' hands in his and his eyes were fixed on hers. Zaid, leaning on his knees, was giving Suleiman glances animated by the keenest passion. They kept this situation for some time, but at the same time giving in to the violence of their desires, they rushed into each other's arms, and hugged each other tightly. The deep silence which had reigned around them until then was disturbed by their sighs, the sound of their kisses, and a few inarticulate words which escaped them. "Do you love me? Adore? Will you still love me? Ah! The last breath of my life will be for Zaid." Mangagul, overwhelmed with sadness, leaned back in an armchair and put his hand over his eyes. He was afraid to see things that one can well imagine, and which were not. After a few moments of silence, "Ah! Dear and tender lover, why have I not always felt you as you are now?" said Zaid. "I would love you no less, and I would have nothing to reproach myself for, but you cry, 'Dear Suleiman, come, dear and tender lover, come, let me wipe your tears.' Suleiman, you lower your eyes, what is the matter? Look at me then, come, dear friend, come, let me console you, put your lips on my mouth, inspire me with your soul, receive mine, suspend No. No." Zaid ended his speech with a violent sigh, and was silent. The engraving represents the second scene of chapter Li, or 2:19. Mangagul, in the background, stealthily observes the meeting of Suleiman and Zaid, the perfect lovers. Zaid draws Suleiman to her, whom she takes by the shoulder. Suleiman's hands dramatically signify his speech to his mistress. The object of the speech is in a way circumscribed by the two hands placed on either side of Zaid's jewel. But Suleiman is powerless. The two lovers are seated in a sofa adorned, at its center top, with a scallop, the symbol of Venus. Above the sofa, a painting represents a man seated against a tree and a woman standing and dancing, her left arm raised. Deep down, Mangagul is leaning on his right elbow, as a sign of jealous melancholy. With his left hand, he points to the window, as if he intends to turn away from the foreground scene. Above him, on the wall, a plasterwork in the form of a comic mask seems to watch the scene, as if to signify its parody dimension. The book, a criticism of Christian ideology with its superstitious excrescences and its insulted and punishing God, restricting humans, was immediately condemned by the authorities. Diderot's story illustrates the way that society has placed a demand for the truth of sex partly by separating us, as conscious subjects, from the subconscious secrets our sexuality. What could be more common than thinking of two noses to the face, and making fun of someone who thinks they have two holes in their s? Diderot, Les Bijoux Indiscrets, 1748. Within the title of Les Bijoux Indiscrets is a double entendre. In 18th-century French, discreet jewels was a euphemism for the vagina. The prince's ring, which is the more literal discreet jewel of the story, causes others to speak indiscreetly of their sexuality, while it remains discreet and opaque, i.e., not transparent or translucent, concerning the mechanism of its own power. At first glance, we might want to treat Les Bijoux Indiscrets as a reflection of the way that sexual secrets and innermost truth had become intertwined, but, the book also offers a surprisingly complex illustration of how sexual secrets and innermost truth related, in turn, to the operations of state power. On doit exiger de moi que je cherche la vérité, mais non que je la trouve. It is required of me that I look for the truth, but not find it. Diderot, Pensées philosophiques. The period between 1748 and 1754, in particular, marked a new departure in his explanation of three major questions: what can we know? How can we know it? How certain is our knowledge? In 1749 Diderot published Lettres sur les aveugles, an essay on blindness, remarkable for its proposal to teach the blind to read through the sense of touch, along lines that Louis Braille was to follow in the 19th century, and for the presentation of the first step in his evolutionary theory of survival by superior adaptation. This daring exposition of the doctrine of materialistic atheism, with its emphasis on human dependence on sense impression, led to Diderot's arrest and incarceration in the dungeon of Château de Vincennes for 3 months. Diderot's work on the L'Encyclopédie, however, was not interrupted for long, and in 1750 he outlined his program for it in a prospectus, which D'Alembert expanded into the momentous Discours préliminaires, 1751. Diderot published few other works in his lifetime, however. His writings were known only to a few of his friends and the privileged correspondents of the handwritten Correspondance Littéraire, a sort of private newspaper edited by Baron Friedrich Melchior Grimm, 1723–1807, circulating at European courts littéraires. The posthumous publication of these manuscripts made Diderot more highly appreciated in the 20th century than he was in France during his lifetime. 4 works of prose fiction by Diderot were published posthumously: the novel La Religieuse, written 1760, published 1796, describes the distressing and ultimately tragic experiences of a girl who is forced to become a nun against her will. La Religieuse was banned for many years because of its depiction of the cloistered fate forced upon many women, entombed in an atmosphere of neurosis and sexual repression. La Religieuse. As a leading figure of the Enlightenment, Diderot fearlessly provoked the wrath of the French establishment through his writings: aristocratic privilege, religious authority, obscurantism, colonialism, militarism, European assumptions of moral authority, and the subordinate role of women were all examined in a flow of Ptolemaic and innovative works in all genres. Early in 1760, full of vitality and intellectually coherent as usual, Diderot began La Religieuse, his first bona fide novel with a well-defined plot, actually a plot within a plot, as well as clearly delineated characters. An articulate and zealous priest under the Empire charged La Religieuse with being partially responsible for bringing on the French Revolution, though the novel was not published until 1796. At approximately the same time it appeared before a somewhat scandalized British reading public, translated as The Nun, or The Nun's Story. Still, 18th-century Europe had for some years been regaled or shocked by accounts of fictional and authentic of social and religious practices, some less edifying than others, in convents and monasteries in various Christian countries, especially France. Diderot's pathetic story of Mlle Simonin, Sister Suzanne, stands out far above and beyond the others, through ingenious admixture of truth and fiction, psychology and aesthetics, portraying social and conventional life in France under the ancient regime in the form of a complex narrative, a narrative within a narrative in which the author attempts transcending the reality of life itself. A novel mingling mysticism, madness, sadistic cruelty, and nascent sexuality, it gives a scathing insight into the 18th century, and has attracted and unsettled readers since a powerfully emblematic fable about oppression and tolerance. It is beautiful literature, elegantly written, charming in its archaism, very easy to read, the vocabulary is accessible, the history is fascinating, not long soporific descriptions. On the contrary, the author is precise in his satire of the life of convent excesses, the sadism of Mother Superior Saint Christine, and the maliciousness of the other sisters, sewing crushed glass in the dark corridors, sure that Suzanne will come to tear her delicate feet there. Or, the private conversations with another superior, Madame, innocent but vain Suzanne sitting on her knees. Is it ingenuous, or subtly perverse, or perhaps both? Later life and works. The completion of the encyclopedia in 1772 left Diderot without a source of income. To relieve him of financial worry, Catherine the Great of Russia first bought his library through an agent in Paris, requesting him to retain the books until she required them, and then appointed him librarian on an annual salary for the duration of his life. Diderot went to St. Petersburg in 1773 to thank her for her support and was received with great honor and warmth. He wrote for her the Plan d'un Université pour le gouvernement de Russie, plan for a university for the government of Russia. He stayed 5 months, long enough to become disillusioned with enlightened despotism as a solution for social ills. Banned from staying in Versailles by Louis XV, Voltaire, still feeling threatened, found himself in a haven of peace, in the region of Gex, and Tournai, French territory, at the Port de Genève, then an independent state. The scene imagined by Jean Huber is a fictional scene. The table above gives a fairly good idea of the entourage that Voltaire maintained in his home in Finis. The following are represented around Voltaire: Père Adam, D'Alembert, Condorcet, Diderot, and La Harpe. Although Diderot never came to Ferney and the other guests had all visited on different occasions. In the center, raising his hand as if to impose silence, Voltaire seems to want to leave the floor to Diderot, seated second from the right, while Condorcet, on the left, continues his aside with the ecclesiastical Father Adam that Voltaire tolerates, also a familiar with the philosopher. In 1775, Diderot met Sophie Valland, with whom he formed an attachment that was to last more than 20 years. The liaison was founded on common interests, natural sympathy, and a deepening fellowship. His correspondence with Sophie, together with his other letters, forms one of the most fascinating documents on Diderot's personality, enthusiasms, and ideas, and on the intellectual society of Louise d'Épinay, F. M. Grimm, the Baron de Holbach, Ferdinando Galliani, and other deistic writers and thinkers, philosophes, with whom he felt most at home. Through Rousseau, Diderot met Etienne Bonnet de Condillac, the philosopher, and for a time the three friends dined together at the Panier Fleury. Diderot's intimate circle was dwindling. Madame d'Épinay and D'Alembert died, leaving only Grimm and Baron de Holbach. Slowly Diderot retired into the shell of his own personal and family life. The death of Sophie Valland in February 1784 was a great grief to him. He survived her by a few months, dying of a coronary thrombosis, emphysema and dropsy in the house that Catherine the Great had put at his disposal, on the Rue de Richelieu, Paris, on July 31, 1784. Apocryphally, his last words were, "Le premier pas vers la philosophie, c'est en Christ." The first step towards philosophy is incredulity. Through the intervention of his son-in-law, Diderot was buried in consecrated ground at Saint Roch. Perhaps the greatest genius of a century of brilliant men. He fulfilled his total promise within his lifetime, but it is only in our time that he has been understood. You ask me why. The more our life is filled up and busy, the less we are attached to it. If that is true, it is because a busy life is for the most part an innocent life. We think less about death, and so we fear it less. Without perceiving it, we resign ourselves to the common lot of all the beings that we watch around us, dying and being born again in an incessant, ever-renewing circle. After having for a season fulfilled the tasks that nature year by year imposes on us, we grow weary of them, and release ourselves. Energies fade, we become feebler, we crave the close of life as after working hard we crave the close of day. Living in harmony with nature, we learn not to rebel against the orders that we see in necessary and universal execution. There is nobody among us who, having worn himself out in toil, has not seen the hour of rest approach with supreme delight. Life for some of us is only one long day of weariness, and death a long slumber, and the coffin a bed of rest, and the earth only a pillow where it is sweet, when all is done, to lay one's head, never to raise it again. I confess to you that, when looked at in this way, and after the long endless crosses that I have had, death is the most agreeable of prospects. I am bent on teaching myself more and more to see it so. The emancipation of the emotion of love in 18th century France marked the beginning of the assertion of sexuality in the European consciousness. Its echoes can be heard in the moral emancipation of the late 19th and 20th centuries. Man falls in love not with a real woman, but with an image he creates for her. Luc de Clépierre de Vauvenargues, 1746. La Religieuse. Diderot's first mature novel, La Religieuse, 1796, is a profoundly moving epistolary narrative that relates the horrific experiences and tribulations endured by a beautiful, talented, unfortunate young woman without vocation, Marie-Suzanne Simonin, rejected, because she is the fruit of her mother's adultery. Marie-Suzanne Simonin's parents cloister her against her liking so that they are not obliged to divide the heritage, the dowry for marriage, between their 3 daughters. Compare Cinderella, Cordelia, King Lear, or Colette, Les Miserables. Who, against her will, is immured in a convent as a nun and forced to take the veil. Note the convent, a controversial site separating female dwelling, allowed women to remain outside the traditional patriarchal family structure and removed from traditional conceptions of sexuality and femininity, fostering female intimacy and permitted women to evade, to some degree, direct subjugation to patriarchal influences. Compare Vestal Virgins. Imprisoned within the walls of several convents on the outskirts of Paris, she undergoes a succession of painful vicissitudes that are related in the first person as memoirs. Finally, managing to escape her cloistered existence, she briefly ekes out a precarious living in the cesspool that was Paris and, having hardly reached womanhood, dies. Diderot did not directly attack the Church, but opposed a man-made system running counter to human nature, and vividly demonstrated some of the dangers of celibacy and sexual repression. Overtones of Diderot's reactions to the lives of Angelique and Didier are apparent in his first great novel, La Religieuse. Diderot's daughter, Angelique, was later to confide, to Meister, that it is the fate of the sister that gave my father the idea for the novel, La Religieuse. What makes La Religieuse such a scandalous novel? Essentially it is the sudden light which it casts on what goes on behind convent walls, the unwilling vocations, the secret illegitimate births, the disastrous physiological effects of forced chastity. It is on the body, deep down in the organism, that convent life finally leaves its mark. In his nun's confessional tale, Diderot's penetrating medical insight shows us how illness, sexual perversion, and madness are the ultimate consequences of a refusal to obey what he calls nature. The reader not only sees into the cells of the convent, but gains access to the secret mechanisms of female existence, as it was understood by the medical science of the 18th century. There will be in the true things, the pathetic ones. La Religieuse is an example of the novel as deception, a work that never formally severs its ties with real life and that always leaves open the possibility that it may turn out to be a genuine document. La Religieuse notoriously grew out of a practical joke played on the witty and volatile Marquis de Croixmare, 1694–1772, prized for his excellent company, who had retired to his estate in Normandy, near Seine, with his daughter. After some 15 months' absence, he was greatly missed by his friends, and the idea was conceived to entice him back to Paris. He had tried during a much publicized lawsuit from 1755 to 58 to help a nun who wished to be released from her vows, but had had no success, and had not met her, and did not even know her name, Marguerite Delamare. Note Sister Marguerite Delamare, member of a wealthy, middle-class family, who was obliged to take the veil at the age of 18. She repeatedly brought before the law courts of Paris the plea to be free from her religious vows. In May, 1758, however, she lost her suit once and for all. She died as a nun and in a convent many years later. The revolutionary authorities offered to release her, but by then it was too late for freedom. Early in 1760, Diderot, in conjunction with Grimm, and Madame d'Épinay, concocted a letter to Croixmare purporting to come from this nun, saying she had got out of the convent, and asking for help. Croixmare replied without hesitation, inviting her to take the diligence to come to Signes, where his chateau would afford her the hospitality and care which she was obviously so desperately in need, and the conspirators had to make her ill to explain her non-appearance. After a considerable correspondence, there was nothing left to do but bring death to the sickness of the poor, suffering, and imaginary girl. They killed her off in May 1760. Croixmare did not find out about the hoax until he returned to Paris in 1768 and discovered it by chance. Diderot, who had forged the nuns' letters, and some in the name of a real Madame Madin, probably a friend of Madame d'Espinay, decided to turn the whole affair into a novel. He wrote it in fragments, then as a complete text in 1760, and then rewrote it again in 1780, when he offered it Grimm's successor, J. H. Meister, for publication in the Correspondance Littéraire. Note: the letters underlying La Religieuse were sent by Grimm in the 1770 Correspondance Littéraire to his correspondents, including the Duke of Zweibrücken and Saxe-Gotha, the princes of Hesse-Darmstadt and Nassau-Saarbrück, the Queen of Sweden, the King of Poland, and the Empress of Russia. The novel has been immensely popular. The text we now have, the result of at least 3 revisions, was published in 1796. There were several French editions between 1796 and 1800, and about 70 up to the beginning of World War II. 19 German translations have been counted, plus 10 Italian, 6 Spanish, and 4 Russian. The good nun is that which brings in the cloister some great fault to expire. Page 82. The story of Suzanne was especially inspired by the anguished life and tragic death of Samuel Richardson's Clarissa Harlowe. In both instances there is the moving story in epistolary or memorial form in which a gifted, most attractive young woman is victimized in a world that represents at once realism, illusion, morality, debauchery, and pathos. Compare de Sotis Justine, Misfortunes of Virtue, and Juliet. Samuel Richardson's novel The History of Clarissa Harlowe was first published in 1747-48. Clarissa, the heroine, is a woman of great integrity. She is wooed by the rake Robert Lovelace. He wants her to live with him out of wedlock, and despite her resistance to the proposal, rapes her. Clarissa's continuing denial of him after this transforms her into a tragic heroine who dominates the last scenes of the book. At one point she is imprisoned for debt. Landseer depicts that moment when she is discovered in jail by Lovelace's friend John Belford. Landseer's choice of subject and his handling of it recall William Hogarth's much earlier modern moral subjects, which influenced many 19th-century genre painters. At the age of 16, Marie, Suzanne Simonin, is forced to enter the convent, by her mother and the man she thinks is her father, a rich lawyer with a very hard character. Note: Marie, Suzanne Simonin, being the principal victim of a living entombment, reflects agonizing experiences from Diderot's own past, confinement in a monastery at his father's behest and incarceration in the dungeon of Vincennes. Conclusion: her mother seems pulled between the love that she must carry for her daughter and her husband. Suzanne has 2 jealous and venal sisters who are cherished by their parents, much more than her. Compare Cinderella, Cosette, Les Miserables, Cordelia, King Lear. A considerable dowry is granted to them, to make a good match, while Suzanne is sent to the convent of Sainte Marie by force. With her great despair and regret, she has no vocation for the life of a nun and refuses to take her final vows, from which she tries to escape throughout the novel. She suspects, rightly, that the cause of the great discrimination which she undergoes is due to the fact that she is not the biological and legitimate daughter of Mr. Simonin, and thus fruit of her mother's adulterous sin and, in the eyes of her mother, the only fault that she has made in her life. Your birth is the one serious sin I have committed. May God forgive me for having brought you into this world. Suzanne's mother's last words to her, page 54. You know what you are and what you can expect from me, unless your intention is to punish me all my life for a sin I have already more than paid for. Suzanne's mother, rejecting her and condemning her to a cloistered fate, page 39. You are still my mother and I am still your child. Suzanne to her mother, her face wet with mingled tears and blood, page 34, 1. Suzanne's mother poisons her to her father, and the girl, eager to please her mother, Suzanne sacrifices herself and agrees to go to the convent, willingly, where she knows a sad destiny. Father Seraphine, both her mother's and Suzanne's confessor, and the deceitful superior, persuade her to take the veil and begin the novitiate, which lasts 2 years. Alas, I have no father or mother, I am a poor, wretched creature they detest and want to bury alive in this place. Suzanne, throwing herself into the deceitful superior's arms, page 23. I had no father, religious scruples had deprived me of a mother, precautions had been taken against my claiming the rights of legitimate birth, there was nothing but harsh domestic captivity, no hope, no resource. Suzanne, realizing no worse fate than being a nun, page 38. I am young and inexperienced, I am afraid of poverty, men, and vice. Suzanne, the convent at Longchamp, page 46. Out of every 100 nuns who die before the age of 50 there are exactly 100 damned, and that taking no account of the ones who in the meantime lose their reason, get feeble-minded or go raving mad. There came a day when a demented nun escaped from the cell where she was shut up. Suzanne saw her. That was the beginning of her fortune, seeing her own fate in that of this unhappy creature, and thereupon a vow was made in her heart. And, on the day for her final vows, renouncing her religious vocation, Suzanne is confined to her cell and silence imposed upon her. The same evil comes either from God who is testing us or from Satan who is tempting. At last the terrible moment came, the bells were none the less eventually rung to inform the world that a woman was about to be condemned to misery. Mass was celebrated, a long sermon which every single word was the opposite of the truth. Since it is my fate to be unhappy, what does it matter where? Suzanne, before being sent to the convent at Longchamp, page 44. I am weary of life and long for death. Madame de Monty to Suzanne, page 49. I am fulfilling my destiny without finding it, carried along by necessity. I am numb, I cannot even cry. Suzanne to Madame de Monty, page 50. The superior of the convent, Madame de Monty, is a very lenient woman, full of kindness and direction, who likes all her nuns. However, Suzanne has her preference, and Madame de Monty likes her passionately. I am fulfilling my destiny without finding it, carried along by necessity. I am numb, I cannot even cry. Sister Saint Suzanne to Reverend Mother de Monty, page 50. And they are very attached to one another. When Madame de Monty dies, her successor, Mother Superior Sister Saint Christine and Suzanne get along very badly. Note, Suzanne's father died at the beginning of January, Mother Superior de Monty died at the end of that same month, and her mother died the following Christmas. Her last words to Suzanne, 54 page, your birth is the one serious sin I have committed. May God forgive me for bringing you into this world. Sister Saint Christine is petty, a muddled narrow spirit of superstitions. She is an odious and cruel woman who is avenged for the love Sister Saint Suzanne carries for the preceding superior, making her live a life of daily torments. Mother de Monty had disapproved of mortifying the flesh, scourging, the wearing of hair shirts, or the spoiling of food with ashes. She said such penances did not correct anyone of any failing but only served to fill people with pride, but, the favorites of the previous reign are never the ones of the next. When nothing wrong could be found in her conduct, something was invented. She was in the wrong every day and every day punished. No courage in the world can hold out in the face of neglect, solitude, and persecution. It became a game to torment her. Her life was a sequence of real or imagined misdemeanors and their punishments. She was overcome by exhaustion, grief, and melancholy. If it was not God who stopped me from destroying myself, why did he not prevent all these other occurrences too? Sister Saint Suzanne, 58 page. The urge to hurt and torment gradually wanes in the world outside, it never does in the cloister. Suzanne manages to acquire paper and composes a memoir, a document of importance which she could not afford to have found in her possession. When the superior demands the memoir, Suzanne denies that any such document exists. I realize that I am destroying myself, but a moment sooner or a moment later is not worth bothering about. They listened at my door, and one day, as I was addressing him in the misery of my heart and calling on him for help, someone said, "You appeal to God in vain, there is no more God for you. Die in despair and be damned," page 86. Compare Job 2.9, Uzit, the wife of Job, telling him curse God and die. You appeal to God in vain, there is no more God for you. Die in despair and be damned. Suzanne's terrible martyrdom starts. She is locked up and beaten. The other nuns flee her like a plague and hate her because of Sister Saint Christine. They crossed themselves when they passed her and fled, shrieking, "Satan, get thee hence! Lord, come to my aid. The demon of impurity had possessed me. Let my fate be a warning, kill your own daughter rather than imprison her in a cloister." Page 85-6. The only one left allied to her is a young, very soft and pure nun, Sister Saint Ursule, who risks helping secret the document from Mother Superior. Sister Saint Ursule has a melancholic nature, a sad person, who fondly loves Suzanne, and does all she can to help her when she undergoes violence caused by the Superior. Suzanne manages to contact a lawyer, Monsieur Manoury, through the intercession of Sister Saint Ursule, and succeeds in instituting proceedings which would deliver her from the life that she hates, but, unfortunately, she loses her lawsuit, fails to win her freedom. Compare the tragedy of Marguerite Delamar, the superior of the convent and its community. Sister Saint Christine does not appreciate the steps taken by Suzanne. Miseries and persecutions follow, and is sent to the punishment cell. A horrible cell in which offenders served their solitary confinement, a little dark underground cell containing some matting half rotten with damp, a piece of black bread and a pitcher of water, with a few other vessels of the coarsest kind. And, on a stone block was a skull with a wooden crucifix, 65 page. An intractable soul can only be tamed by violent means. Sisters Saint Agnes and Saint Julie, to Reverend Mother Superior Sister Saint Christine. Suzanne undergoes tortures, she is deprived of food and clean clothing, wounded by the others, and rest is denied to her. Suzanne is ordered never to say anything about her misfortunes. She replies, "What you have done must be very wrong, since you demand my oath to keep silence. Nobody will ever know anything about it except your conscience, I swear." How resilient nature is in the young. People can suffer a long time before dying. Suzanne, driven to desperation, confides to her only friend, Sister Saint Ursule. "My soul easily catches fire, becomes exalted and is deeply moved. I had a heart of flesh and the others hearts of stone. I was, I am, and all my life I shall be dissatisfied with my lot. I am and always will be a bad nun, and by doing what saves others I hate and condemn myself." Suzanne to Sister Saint Christine, PAGE 76. "My child, you are possessed of the devil." The malicious superior's reply, page 77, "Sometimes more courage is required to live than to die. The past guarantees the future, and if she was more inclined towards crime perhaps she would be free today, committing acts sacrilegious in the eyes of God and abhorrent to those of men." Compare Justine and Juliet by the Marquis de Sade. Suzanne is made to lie in a coffin and humiliated. Her strength sapped by the lack of food and the poor quality of food that she had, revolting food spoiled by having ashes and all sorts of filth mixed with it, and even more by the struggle she was having to bear so many repeated acts of inhumanity. Given only enough food to prevent her dying of starvation, prevented from sleeping, and overwhelmed with mortifications and terrors, Suzanne was reduced to a corpse. What favor am I to ask God for? Judged, condemned, and executed, imminent death made me want to cry out. Suzanne, in a low faint voice, to Sister Saint Christine, page 90. My God, have mercy on me. My God, have mercy on me. Dear sisters, try not to hurt me too much. Suzanne to the 3 nuns accompanying Sister Saint Christine, page 91. People being led to execution are virtually dead before being executed. What profound wisdom there is in what blind philosophy calls the folly of the cross. She saw the pointlessness of life and was only too happy to lose it. She was barely 20. O God, have pity on me. O God, give me strength. My God, do not abandon me. Forgive me if I have given offense. Suzanne, believing she is to be executed by the superior and her myrmidons, page 92. Dragged on her knees before the vicar general, Suzanne is brutally presented as being haunted, possessed, crazy, in order to discredit her. But the archdeacon, a just man, though insensitive, one of those unfortunate enough to be born to practice virtue without knowing its charm, examines Suzanne and discovers beneath her dirty habit, her bruised head, bleeding feet, livid and fleshless arms. I can hear you saying, so many horrors, so varied and so continuous. A series of calculated atrocities in religious souls. It defies all probability. I agree with you, but it is true, my present situation is deplorable, life is a burden to me. Suzanne to the reader, Le Marquis de Croixmare, ppage 98, 99. It's horrible. Christians. Nuns. Human beings. Horrible. The archdeacon, indignant, shaking his head, to Sister Saint Christine, page 100. When you set limits to your defense and have to deal with opponents who set none to their attack, who trample underfoot just and unjust alike, who make allegations or denials with the same aplomb and who blush neither at imputations, suspicions, gossip, nor calumny, you can hardly expect to win. In a properly governed state it should be difficult to enter into religion but easy to come out. Were monks and nuns instituted by Jesus Christ? Can the Church positively not do without them? What need has the bridegroom of so many fresh victims? Will they never realize the necessity for narrowing the entrance to these chasms into which future generations are going to plunge to their doom? Can God, who made man so inconsistent and frail, authorize such rash vows? Can these vows, which run counter to our natural inclinations, ever be properly observed except by a few abnormal creatures in whom the seeds of passion are dried up, and whom we should rightly classify as freaks of nature? Do all theses lugubrious ceremonies played out at the taking of the habit or the profession, when a man or a woman is set apart for the monastic life and for woe, suspend the animal functions? A vow of poverty means binding oneself an oath to be an idler and a thief. A vow of chastity means promising God continual breaking of the wisest and most important of his laws. A vow of obedience means giving up man's inalienable prerogative, freedom. If one observes these vows one is a criminal, if not one is a perjurer. The cloistered life is that of a fanatic or a hypocrite. Mr. Manurai's unsuccessful argument advocating Sister Saint Suzanne's plight, page 100-104. The past tells me what the future has in store. I have envied the blissful vacuity of mind of my companions, and implored God for it, but it has not been vouchsafed and he will not give it. Suzanne to Mr. Manurai, page 109. Next day the superior came to her cell accompanied by a nun carrying a hair shirt and the coarse garment she had been dressed in when she was put in the dungeon. That was how she was dressed when, that evening, after she had retired to her cell, she heard a procession approaching, singing litanies. It was the whole convent in double file. A rope was put around her neck, a lighted torch in one hand and a scourge in the other. She was led away in silence. Her feet were covered in blood from cuts made by bits of glass spitefully thrown in her path. The reason why her feet had not been cut up on the last 2 days was that Sister Ursule had been careful to sweep the corridor stealthily, so to move the bits of glass to either side. On the days that Suzanne was condemned to fast on bread and water, Ursule went without part of her portion, which wrapped in a clean white cloth and threw into her cell. She seemed almost changed as Suzanne was. She was terrifyingly thin and her face bore the pallor of death, her lips were bloodless and her eyes almost unseeing. I love you. Sister Saint Ursule to Suzanne, page 111. Suzanne's health could not hold out against such prolonged and harsh ordeals, and she fell ill. It was at this juncture that Sister Ursule showed the full extent of her friendship for her. But all her devotion failed to halt the progress of illness, and Suzanne was soon at death's door and received the last sacraments. After receiving the last rites she fell into a kind of lethargy, and Sister Ursule despaired of her life all that night. My God, have pity on her and me. My God, receive her soul. Dearest friend, when you are before God remember Sister Ursule. Sister Saint Ursule, page 113. After a very long convalescence, Suzanne began to recover, but her illness was infectious, and Sister Ursule had barely left her side. When she began to recover her strength, Sister Ursule's was declining. Go and ring the bell for her and have her buried. Sister Saint Christine, page 116. Mr. Manoury manages to have her transferred to a different convent, her new prison in Arpajon, where boarders were mixed up with novices, novices with nuns, and people ran in and out of each other's rooms. Madame is superior of the General Assembly, and of the Freemasons of Arpajon. She is a small, round lady, thoughtless but very sharp, with large black eyes, always moving and full of energy, and a lesbian who, the first time she sees her, falls passionately in love with Suzanne. Madame dedicates a true worship to her and covers her with kisses and caresses, which attracts the hatred of Sister Therese, who was formerly the favorite. I am a lost soul. Sister Saint Therese to Suzanne, page 132. A lost soul, why? You must think me the most evil creature in the world. Sister Saint Suzanne's reply, page 132. The kindnesses the Superior shows for Suzanne have given Sister Saint Therese cause for alarm, and she jealously fears Suzanne might gain preference, always a kiss on her white, smooth, forehead or beautifully shaped neck, sparkling eyes, soft, pink cheeks, tiny and dimpled hands, firm and admirably formed bosom or arms, but most often on the mouth, for she thought Suzanne had sweet breath, white teeth, fresh ruby lips, the tips of her fingers touching her breast, sighing and oppressed with heavy breathing, her kisses spreading over Suzanne's neck, bare shoulders and half-naked breast. Trembling began to come over her, confusion of speech, uncontrollable movements of her eyes and hands, her knees pressing between Suzanne's, the ardor of her embraces and the tightness of her arms as she held Suzanne, all showed Suzanne that her malady was about to come over her again. She is capable of passing from the greatest tenderness to ferocity. Sister Saint Therese to Suzanne, concerning the Superior, page 140. Shedding tears is a delicious state for a sensitive soul, making the roses of the cheeks wither. The Superior to Suzanne, page 141 to 142. Suzanne didn't know what was going on inside of her, but she was seized with panic, and her own trembling and faintness justified the suspicion she had had that her trouble was contagious. Suzanne questioned herself, examining her conscience, vague, crazy, ridiculous notions that she put out of her mind. It has never occurred to you to run your hands over that lovely bosom, those legs, that body, that firm, soft, white flesh of yours. The Superior to Suzanne, page 147. But, dear mother, that is forbidden. What would they say if it were known? Suzanne to the Superior, page 149. I am the one who rewards and punishes here. I forbid it in others, but I allow it in you, and am asking you to do so. Just let me warm myself a minute and then I'll go. Give me your hand. Feel me, touch me, and see for yourself. I am all shivering and stone cold. The Superior to Suzanne, page 150. Suzanne would not have wanted to tear a single hair out of the head of her most cruel enemy. How can you refuse things which give great pleasure to another person on whom you are totally dependent, things in which you can see no harm yourself? Sister Saint Suzanne, called the reserved, not quite 20 years of age, is very innocent and sees nothing evil in the affections of the superior, however, but when she is confessed to the director of the convent, Page Lemoyne, he compares the strangeness of the superior's love for Suzanne with Satan. He spoke of the superior in terms which made her shudder, calling her outrageous, a libertine, a wicked nun, a pernicious woman, a corrupt soul, and enjoined her on pain of mortal sin never to be alone with her and to submit to none of her advances. One only goes to confession to acknowledge one's sins, and I see no sin. Cruel sister, ask for my life and I will give it to you, but don't avoid me. I couldn't go on living without you, my dearest. The Superior to Suzanne, page 167 to 169. A delicate flower is only kept fresh and stainless, by the special protection of Providence. Your superior is sunk in the abyss of crime and seeks to drag you down, into hell by a violent death. You are doomed. Father Lemoyne to Suzanne, page 162 to 163. The superior, for all her quirks and caprices, was one of the most sensitive women in the world. Suzanne is terrified by a strange effect of her own imagination. Perhaps he can discern in the most innocent acts on your part and mine seeds of inner corruption which he believes are already fully developed in you and fears you will develop in me. Suzanne to the Superior, concerning Father Lemoyne, page 166. Page Lemoyne is constrained to leave the convent because of the complaints of Madame, and he is replaced in his functions as director by Dom Morel who, just like Suzanne, was also forced to enter into religious vocations and wishes to give up his statute. He brings her moral support by listening to her troubles and misfortunes, and giving her counsel. It is he which encourages her at the end to escape from the convent at Arpajon. Amplius, Domini. Lord, still more. One day Suzanne emerged from her cell and found the superior flat on the ground with her arms extended and face flat to the floor, and she said, come on, and trample me underfoot. I don't deserve any other treatment. How can the endearments and caresses of a woman be dangerous to another woman? Where is the evil in loving each other, saying so and showing it? It is so delightful. Suzanne to Dom Morel, page 176. There is such a thing as poisonous knowledge. Dom Morel to Suzanne, page 176, this is what happens sooner or later when you go against the universal law of nature. Healing mists which the heart throws round reason are sometimes blown away. Eventually, after paroxysms of fervor and guilt the superior, too, dies, of sorrow and in madness. Sister Therese, a whining girl who complains without stop, sickens with jealousy, also soon dies. The convent has a new superior, elderly and full of superstitions. Suzanne is accused of casting spells over Madame, and her tribulations start all over again. Here the memoirs of Sister Saint Suzanne become disconnected. Suzanne is then rather perfunctorily allowed by Diderot to escape to Paris, exposed to the importunities of the young Benedictine who helps her, a vile seducer taking indecent liberties. She is exposed to all the riotous scenes of a disorderly house, accosted by men, and women, and condemned to a place of detention for prostitutes and destitute women, the Salpêtrière. Living in a state of continual alarm, almost all of her nights are sleepless, until she finds, finally, a small employment in a laundry. Marie, surely you are not soft enough to waste tears on a wicked nun with no morals and no religion, who falls in love with a horrible monk and runs away with him. You must have a lot of pity to spare. All she had to do was eat, drink, pray to God and sleep. She was very well off where she was, so why didn't she stay there? She is a slut, and God will punish her. The laundress to Suzanne, concerning the public knowledge of her escape, page 187. Overwhelmed with fatigue, surrounded by terrors, peace deserting her, Suzanne finishes composing her memoirs in the form of a letter to the Marquis de Croixmare, who agrees to give her employment as a chambermaid, but hurts herself in an accident while getting away, and dies. I suffered much, but the fate of my persecutors appears to me and always appeared to me more to feel sorry for them. I would have better liked to die than to leave my role, in the condition of taking theirs. My sorrows will finish, I hope for it your kindness, the memory, the shame, and the remorse of the crime will remain to them until their last hour. They are shown already, do not doubt it, they will show all their life, and terror will go down under the tomb with them. So Suzanne Simonin. Conclusion. Among other allusions to madness, is the growing dementia of Reverend Mother Superior Madam, who begins lying long hours in bed, indulging in erotic reverie, and fondling herself. She then feels sexually drawn to the younger members of her convent. Particularly attracted to Sister Suzanne, the reserved, but unable to seduce her, she becomes tormented, finally overwhelmed by inexplicable guilt, sinks into a profound nervous depression, and dies. The theme of the madness could have derived specifically from Diderot's own sister, insane in her mid-twenties, and that of lesbianism from his insistent suspicion of abnormal relations between his beloved Sophie and her enticing sister. The litany of madness, hysteria or delirium, closely linked to the phenomenon of genius, like Julien Lemaitre, the miscreant of the philosophic school, the most notorious materialist of that day and the author of A Home Machine. Diderot held that the mind could affect the body, and the body the mind. Moreover, Diderot, like Lemaitre, who was a medical doctor, believed that man, the machine, or the animal, is so complicated that we can never hope to discover his essence nor even all the springs that control human behavior. The novel is often praised for its balanced depiction of female homosexuality within the cloister and of the results of sexual frustration on those subjected to enforced celibacy. It is true that some of the religious, male and female, are depicted as intelligent, devout, and humane, but that the author felt physical impulses should at any rate not automatically be frustrated as being in some way incompatible with moral fulfillment. Man is, in Diderot's view, a social being, and the dangers of solitude, of sequestration, are everywhere apparent in La Religieuse. Monastic celibacy seemed to Diderot to be socially wasteful, and he understood the ritual cruelty to which ecclesiastical discipline can lead. If the possibility of genuine vocations, saintly nuns, and discerning directors is respected in the book, there are also the clear and familiar warnings. L'homme est né pour la société, séparez-les, isolez-les, sesides s'uniront, son caractère se tournera, mille affections ridicules se livront dans son cœur. Man is born for society. Segregate him, and his ideas will become disintegrated, his character will be spoiled, and 1,000 ridiculous affections will rise in his heart. From a literary point of view, the most interesting thing about the novel is the way in which the dialogue obtrudes, to the extent that parts of the text read as if they were written for the stage. The psychology is delicate, sometimes subtle, though the composition is hasty, but Diderot uses what is essentially a dramatic technique. He allows the reader psychological insight only into Suzanne, the supposed author of the first-person narrative, leaving us to make judgments about the other characters on the grounds alone of their externally observed behavior, as recounted in the novel. However well calculated the original deception of Croixmare, the novel as published could scarcely have been written by the Diderot of 1760. The writing is too practiced, the psychology too subtle, and the dialogue too skillful. The propaganda is vigorous, the innocence of Suzanne cleverly exploited to avoid obscuring the message with an overlay of prurience, and a strong sense of the dramatic does not interfere with verisimilitude, but the novel's imaginative vision and the exceptional qualities of its principal characters may be thought scarcely adequate to make the novel a literary achievement of the highest level. Libertine works are not, as is commonly thought, characterized by the preaching of sexual pleasure but are instead linked by an ethics of pleasure, which teaches readers that vanity and sensual enjoyment are part of their moral being. The novel is a powerful vehicle for moral lessons, more so than philosophical treatises, because it conveys such lessons through pleasure. The proliferation of libertine novels as a reaction against denial of pleasure in the literature and culture of the time, in the midst of the century's metaphysical impulse to simplify human psychology, affords a more complex picture of moral being and ultimately contributed a lesson of tolerance to the Enlightenment. I forgive all to men, except injustice, ingratitude, and inhumanity. Denis Diderot. Appendix, A summary. Historical background, a concise summary. French literature in the 18th century spans the period from the death of Louis XIV of France, through regents, and the reigns of Louis XV of France and of Louis XVI of France to the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789, a period of prose and reason, and also of general ideas, many of which were to prove destructive to the existing institutions of church and state. The death of Louis XIV in 1715 set into motion a social revolution marked by licentiousness and then by intellectual liberation and philosophical inquiry. The era of the French regents, 1715 to 1723, when France was governed by the 5-year-old child king's uncle, Philippe d'Orléans, was a period ruled by licentious freedom. The regents marks the temporary eclipse of Versailles as a center for policy making, since the regent's court was at the Palais Royal in Paris. It marks the rise of Parisian salons as cultural centers, as literary meeting places and nuclei of discreet liberal resistance to some official policies. In the Paris salons, aristocrats mingled more easily with the haute bourgeoisie in a new atmosphere of relaxed decorum, comfort, and intimacy. The spirit of the regents was critical, skeptical, and innovating. Ideas of liberty, toleration, humanitarianism, equality, and progress were advocated increasingly. Louis XIV had died, leaving a great public debt. The regent had recourse to taxation and other arbitrary and violent expedients for raising money, when in the midst of the general confusion of affairs the Scotchman John Law began to rise to notice. Law's Bank, declared the Royal Bank at the end of the year 1718, had acquired monopoly privileges, and exchanging bank notes for gold, reimbursed creditors of the state. Everything was easy for the government when it had the gold of the people. At the commencement of 1720, Law found himself at the height of his fortune, and having abjured the Protestant faith, was made Controller General, but from this time dates his fall. His principal error had been that he looked upon paper money as a perfect equivalent for coin, and the fatal consequences of this error had been aggravated by the ignorance and cupidity of the government. Law was arrested, and summoned to give in his accounts, which he did with an admirable clearness which confounded his enemies. But this illustrious man possessed neither genius nor power sufficient to quell the storm, and misfortunes followed each other in rapid succession. Law then quitted France and retired to Venice, abandoning to the regent all his fortune. Pestilence had broken out in France, closing almost all ports to French vessels, and was causing frightful ravages in Provence. The number of its victims is unknown, but the 4 cities of Marseilles, Arles, Aix, and Toulon, alone, lost 79,500 of their inhabitants. Louis XV was declared of age by the Parliament in January, 1723. The regent died of apoplexy in December, 1723, but before his death he had projected a marriage between the king and the Infanta of Spain, a child of 4 years of age. 3 persons only constituted the king's council, the Duke of Bourbon, Fleury, Bishop of Fréjus, and Marshal Villars. The first laws made under this ministry were both foolish and wicked. Heavy taxes were levied throughout the kingdom, and barbarous laws enacted against the Protestants. The Duke of Bourbon broke off the marriage which had been projected between the king and the Infanta of Spain, substituting for her Maria Leczinski, the daughter of Stanislaus, formerly crowned King of Poland, and, who, stripped of his royal state, lived in obscurity at Weissenberg. In the following year, the misery of the people was so great, and the outcries against the government so fierce and frequent, that it was found necessary to dismiss the Duke of Bourbon from his office. The king declared that henceforth he would have no first minister. The functions of this office were virtually discharged by the king's old tutor Fleury, who had acquired a great ascendancy over the king. The Emperor Charles VI died in 1740, in the confident hope that his daughter Maria Theresa, Queen of Hungary, would inherit his states. Frederick II, King of Prussia, was the first to launch his battalions, invading Silesia in 1741, beginning the European War for Austrian Succession, 1740–1748. Terms of peace were signed for at Aix-la-Chapelle, in 1748, but this war had added 1,200 millions to the French debt. One is not always an animal for having sometimes been one. Diderot, Les Bijoux Indiscrets, 1748. Louis XV, in spite of his shameful debaucheries, was extremely scrupulous in respect to his outward observances of religion, and took an active part in the religious quarrels by which France was agitated. Such was the state of excitement in the capital when, on January 5, 1757, an unhappy wretch, named Damiens, slightly wounded the king at the gates of the Palace of Versailles. After the trial and execution of Damiens, Louis XV endeavored to conciliate the popular feeling. The king's mistress, the Marquise de Pompadour, who was dismissed from the palace whilst the king considered himself in danger from his wound, returned in triumph. The governments of France and England were disputing in Asia and America for the possession of immense territories. The war which broke out in 1756 between England and France speedily embraced the whole of Europe, and its ravages extended over the entire world. Louis XV was gained over to support the cause of Maria Theresa by the influence of Madame de Pompadour, and soon all the forces of France were placed at the disposal of Austria, as the terrible and deplorable 7 Years' War, 1756–1773, commenced. Quebec was taken by the English in 1759, and in the following year the French suffered losses in Africa and Asia, as well. England, France, Spain, and Portugal then signed on February 10, 1763, the Treaty of Paris, which was disgraceful to France. This power ceded to England a portion of Louisiana, the remainder was ceded by France to Spain, to recompense the cession of Florida to England. The last years of this war were signalized by the abolition of the Order of the Jesuits in France. Their order was suppressed throughout the kingdom by an edict of 1764, which gave them permission to reside in France only as simple private persons. All the Bourbon courts declared themselves at the same time against the Jesuits, who were successively driven from Portugal, Spain, Naples, and Parma, and the total suppression of the order was ultimately procured at Rome from Clement XIV, who thus destroyed the firmest supports of the rights of the papal court of Rome. Prussia and Russia were the only states who gave the Jesuits an asylum and protection. Madame de Pompadour died in 1764, and was soon afterwards succeeded as mistress to Louis XV by a woman of low origin, afterwards known as the Countess du Barry. The 7 Years' War added 34 millions of annual interest to the national debt, and the taxes, which had enormously increased during the war, were not lessened at the peace. 2 edicts were issued which abolished the old parliament and established a new. The public wrath burst forth against despotic power. Letters de cachet sent murmurers either into exile or to the Bastille. At the close of 1771, in the space of less than a year, the new judicial arrangements were in force over the whole kingdom. The taxes were at the same time raised to an exorbitant amount. Louis XV, utterly apathetic in the midst of these serious events, continued to present to the world an example of shameful debauchery, and complete indifference to scandal. Strong in her amity with Frederick II and Maria Theresa, and the supine indolence of Louis XV, Catherine II, the Empress of Russia, signed in 1772, with the courts of Prussia and Vienna, a treaty for the dismemberment of Poland. This preliminary division deprived the country of a third of its territory, and led to other treaties which effaced Poland from the number of independent nations. He had Madame du Barry publicly presented at court, and gave her a distinguished place at the table at which were present for the first time after their marriage his grandson, the Dauphin, and his young spouse, Marie Antoinette of Austria. At length, worn out by ennui, weary of pleasure, and disgusted with all things, he died of smallpox in the 64th year of his life, and after a reign of 59 years, which is one of the most deplorable in history. The favorites of the previous reign are never the favorites of the following reign. Diderot, Les Bijoux Indiscrets, 1748. Louis XVI ascended the throne on the May 11, 1774, at the age of 20. His morals were pure, his intentions upright and generous, but, to complete inexperience, he added a great want of decision of character. He chose as his first minister, Maurepas, who recalled the old parliaments, but knew not how to make them submit to useful and efficient reforms. They were reinstalled on November 12, and the privileged classes burst forth into complaints. The general management of the national finances fell into the hands of a Genoese banker, Necker, who placed France in a position to support a war occasioned by the rebellion of the English colonies of North America in 1773, against England, overburdened by debt after the Peace of 1763. The Congress of the Revolted Colonies published, in 1776, the Act of Independence, by which it constituted itself a free power, and independent of English rule. France concluded a treaty of alliance and commerce with the Americans, and in the following year with Spain. Maurepas, offended by lavish praises bestowed upon Necker, maligned him to the king, and the eminent financier, perceiving that he no longer possessed his sovereign's confidence, sent in his resignation, which was accepted on May 23. Peace was at length signed at Versailles on September 3, 1783, between England on the one part, and France, Spain, and the United States, whose independence was recognized, on the other. Maurepas died soon after the disgrace of Necker. Joly de Fleury and d'Ormesson succeeded Necker in turn without being able to discover a remedy for the deficit of the treasury which had increased during the war, and Calonne succeeded them in the management of the finances, adopting a system directly opposed to that of Necker, endeavoring to strengthen the government credit by prodigality. Calonne, to enforce Parliament's submission, convoked an assembly of notables, 1787, hoping it would be more docile than the parliaments and the Estates General. He could not, however, conceal from the notables the fact that within a few years there was a deficit of 115 millions in the revenue, and resigned. He was succeeded by L'Amami de Brienne. Archbishop of Senators Brienne perceived that it was only possible to overcome the resistance of the Parliament by suppressing it, and in conjunction with M. de Laguignon, the new keeper of the seals, he persuaded the king to agree to a plan which destroyed the political authority of the magistracy. By this scheme an assembly of the principal persons of the kingdom was to be constituted, endowed with all the authority of the plenary courts of the time of Charlemagne. This court was to regulate the general police laws, and the edicts, which were no longer to be submitted to the parliaments. All the provinces were in a state of agitation, by 1788, and almost everywhere the privileged classes, for the sake of preserving their own privileges, gave to the masses of the people a dangerous example of resistance and insurrection. Brienne was resolved, at any price, to remain in power, but a court intrigue overthrew him and he resigned, at the same time advising Louis XVI to recall Necker, as the only man capable of restoring the finances to a satisfactory state. But, skillful as he was as a financier, this minister was not equal, as politician, to the task of grappling with the perilous circumstances by which France was now surrounded. The moment of crisis drew near when the king convoked the Second Assembly of the Notables, to which was submitted the question as to how the Estates General should be convoked. It commenced its sittings on November 9, 1788, and divided itself into 6 committees, one of which alone declared in favor of the double representation of the Third Estate. The Third Estate now perceived its strength, it reckoned with good reason the support of a portion of the noblesse and the clergy, and foresaw that it would be able to control the method of deliberation. From this moment the revolution was inevitable. The Estates General commenced their sittings on May 5, 1789, at Versailles. On June 17, a National Assembly consisting of the deputies of the Third Estate and the dissenting portion of the nobility and clergy, sanctioning the temporary levying of existing taxes, consolidating the public debt. Violent measures proposed by the court were now evident, and the deputies resolved their being carried into execution. They unanimously swore, with one exception, that they would bestow a constitution on France, the oath of the Tennis Court, June 20, 1789. A royal sitting took place on June 23, the king recognizing the assembly as the order of the Third Estate, commanding its dissolution. The members of the nobility and clergy immediately obeyed, but those of the commons persisted in maintaining the inviolability of its members. From thenceforth the royal authority was at an end. Despite the resistance of the nobility, 47 members of the noblesse, with the Duke of Orleans at their head, joined the Third Estate, and the majority of the clergy, and were received with enthusiasm. The fusion of the several orders in a single assembly, however, was not yet complete, and as this circumstance produced an extreme state of agitation, Necker again advised the union of the three orders, and as the Queen and many influential persons supported his views, Louis XVI yielded, and after June 27 the clergy, the noblesse, and the Third Estate formed only one national and constituent assembly. The distinction between the orders became extinct. All moral authority having passed from the monarch to the assembly, the advisers of Louis XVI imprudently persuaded him to have recourse, too late, to force. Troops were assembled in large bodies around Versailles, and Necker was exiled, producing a feeling of great excitement in Paris. Camille Desmoulins, a young and ardent demagogue, harangued the populace in the garden of the Palais Royal, and exhorted them to rush to arms. The crowd replied with acclamations, and he then proposed that a patriotic color should be adopted, green, the symbol of hope. The orator then tore a leaf from a tree and attached it to his hat. Everyone followed his example, and the trees of the garden were almost entirely denuded of their foliage. A tumult took place, troops refused to act, barriers were set on fire, and many houses were pillaged. The National Assembly placed the public debt under the protection of French honor, and constituted itself a permanent assembly. The populace of Paris was eager to follow up its first successes, and demanded arms. A committee of electors sitting at the Hôtel de Ville organized the National Guard, which it raised to the number of 48,000 men, and to which, on the proposal of Lafayette, it gave the tricolored cockade. This cockade united white, the ancient color of the flag of France, with red and blue, the colors of the city of Paris. To the Bastille! To the Bastille! Became the cry of the excited populace, and the siege of the Bastille was immediately commenced. The French guards revolted, aided the mob with cannon, and secured the capture of the citadel, the feeble garrison of which surrendered. The people, bearing on their pikes the bleeding trophies of their triumph, returned with immense uproar to the Hôtel de Ville, and speedily signalized their victory with many assassinations. Blood flowed in all directions and a civil war was imminent. The court only regarded the insurrection as a riot. The king proceeded in person to dissolve the assembly. Louis XVI entered the Hôtel de Ville, unaccompanied by guards, received the tricolored cockade amidst the acclamations of the multitude, and did not return to Versailles until he had sanctioned the acts of the people. The return of Necker to Paris was a triumph for him, but it was also the last of his prosperity. From thenceforth he endeavored, but in vain, to struggle against revolution. The insurrection movements in Paris extended to the provinces. Everywhere the people formed themselves into municipalities and national guards. Armed mobs pillaged and burned the castles of the nobility in all parts of France. The flight of the royal family, June 20, 1791, the king was arrested at Varennes, and brought to Paris, where he was received with terrible silence. The Assembly declared that it was not competent to try Louis XVI, or to pronounce his dethronement, but for the sake of calming the popular excitement, it decreed that the king would have to abdicate de facto, and have ceased to be inviolable if he should wage war against the nation, or suffer it to be done in his name. Danton aroused insurgency. The king proceeded with his family to the hall of the Assembly amidst the vociferations of the populace. This was the last day of the monarchy, August 10, 1792. Louis XVI was taken to the temple with his family. Compare the tragic end of the Romanov dynasty and the emergence of communism in Marxist Russia. The outstanding figures, Payets Grigory Efimовich Rasputin, the Staryets, and the Tsarina, Anastasia. And September 20 was appointed as the day for opening the assembly which was to decide the destinies of the nation. An Austrian-Prussian alliance threatened the northern frontier, in August 1792. Terror reigned throughout Paris, numerous arrests were made by order of the Commune. During 3 days, commencing September 2, 1792, nobles and priests were murdered by ruffians in the midst of a hideous parody of judicial forms. The brutal mob made horrible saturnalia in the temple, and displayed under the window, in the sight of the queen, the head of her friend, the unfortunate Princess Lamollette. The assembly was unable to check the massacres. The Commune reigned alone in Paris. Proclamation of the Republic, September 20, the Legislative Assembly dissolved itself, and took the name of the National Convention. Its first act was to abolish royalty, and to proclaim a republic. The Gourdonists desired a legal and constitutional form of government in the republic. Danton, Robespierre, and Marat were more audacious and less scrupulous as to the means by which they achieved their ends. Marat, a furious fanatic, had rendered himself the apostle of murder by his discourses, and in his journal, The Friend of the People, he advocated recourse to dictatorship for the purpose of subduing the enemies of the people, and exterminating them in a body, every day organizing fresh massacres. The Gourdonists, although stronger in the assembly than their rivals, accused Robespierre of seeking to establish a tyranny, but yielded to their enemies, the Commune of Paris and the Club of the Jacobins, who were proclaiming the unity and indivisibility of the Republic. The debate on the king's trial began on the 23rd of November. It was decided to bring him before the convention on a variety of charges, the chief of which was conspiracy with European powers to overthrow the sovereignty and liberties of the common people. The Gourdonists openly expressed their desire to save him. His execution was fixed for January 21, at 10:30. Louis XVI arrived at the Place de la Révolution, to suffer the outrage of his fate, with God as his only recompense. I die innocent, I pardon my enemies, and you, unhappy people. The rolling of the drums silenced his voice. When the Gourdonists resisted the establishment of an arbitrary and formidable revolutionary tribunal, created on March 20, 1793, they were branded as intriguers and enemies of the people. Their insurrection had provoked the convention to cruel measures against priests and nobles, and their destruction was resolved. On May 31, Lanjuinais denounced that all revolutionary authorities in the capital should be deposed. Henriette was appointed to command the ragged partisans of the Commune and the Jacobins. The Gourdonists were especially denounced by Robespierre and Marat, with the object of freeing the assembly from the tyranny of the Jacobins and the Commune. The whole convention arose, and set forth with the president at its head. It met Henriette on horseback, sword in hand. "What does the people want?" asked the president. "It demands that 24 criminals be handed up to it," replied Henriette. The convention no longer opposed the arrest of the proscribed deputies, and Marat constituted himself dictator as to their fates. From that moment the Gourdonist party was crushed, and the convention was no longer free. The heroic Charlotte Corday, a young girl endowed with an ardent soul, stabbed the atrocious Marat in his bath, and she died on the scaffold with exemplary courage. On the 2nd of June, Lyons declared itself against the convention. The convention appointed a committee of public safety, with Robespierre as a principal member. The Republic ordered frightful executions and horrible massacres. The extermination of the unfortunate city of Lyons was ordered. The scaffold was too slow an instrument for the decrees of the committee, and the vanquished insurgents were mowed down by musketry. In Paris, the Queen, the noble Marie Antoinette, perished. The guerdonists who were proscribed on June 2 soon followed. The public credit was abolished, and the expenses of the government were supplied by the sale of the property of proscribed persons. Despotic measures were enforced by threats. The new era was consecrated, and the Christian calendar was replaced, dating from the period at which the Republic was founded. The leaders of the Commune and their accomplices were all seized and condemned, and most of them died as cowards, on March 24, 1794. Danton and his friends were arrested, in turn, on March 30, and Robespierre prevented their being heard in the Assembly. Robespierre had now obtained the height of his power, and was to be speedily followed by his fall. Conspiracy against Robespierre, relying on the support of the Jacobins and the mob, denounced Danton et al. As enemies to the Republic in the Convention. A cry arose from every side, "Down with the tyrant!" Terror reigned in the Assembly. The Convention assumed the offensive, attacking the Commune and put its members beyond the pale of the law. Robespierre sat motionless, as though paralyzed, petrified by irresolution. The Hôtel de Ville was surrounded by cries of "Long live the Convention!" He was seized, together with his colleagues and the principal members of the Commune, and on the following day they were tried by the same revolutionary tribunal which they had so long ago fed victims, and which now sent them in their turn to the scaffold, trembling with fear. The reign of terror was at an end. Anarchy prevailed. Rire bien qui rire le dernier. He who laughs last, laughs best. Last sentence of Diderot's Le Neveu.